Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this session, which is part of OSRL's Wildlife Week 2024, which we're doing in collaboration with our wildlife partners from CLARM and GOWRS. My name's Paul Kelway, and I'm the Wildlife Technical Authority at OSRL. And this is the third time that we've done an annual Wildlife Week at OSRL, so it gives us an opportunity to really focus on this theme and dive a bit deeper into some different aspects of wildlife emergency preparedness and response. And we've got a few different activities coming up. So this is actually the first of 4 webinars we've got over the next pretty much 24 hours, in fact. So if you're up for a double header, there is in fact a Spanish-speaking webinar coming right after this one. That's going to be looking at wildlife response, developing wildlife response preparedness in South America. And then we've got 2 tomorrow, one on wildlife response in the incident management system, which is more dedicated to the Asia Pacific time zones. And we've got one on wildlife response in offshore and nearshore events. So if you would like to sign up and you haven't already, please have a look at the OSRL website under events, and you'll see the links to sign up there. But for this webinar, we're going to be looking at the impact of legislation in relation to wildlife response around the world, and also some of the implications on preparedness and response efforts. So this is our kickoff discussion on this. And we have a few aims for today. So we want to have a look and provide a better understanding of just the wide variability in legislation, so different contexts of response and preparedness, and consider and accommodate some of these in relation to building preparedness. We hope to provide a few real-world examples to you in terms of national and regional legislation and how they may influence wildlife response frameworks and systems, and also just demonstrate, hopefully, the value of developing wildlife response preparedness ahead of time, and also the value of including local wildlife response organizations in those efforts as well. The session is being recorded, so if you have registered, you will get a link to access that recording afterwards as well, just so you're aware of that. So to go through these themes today, I'm delighted to be joined by 2 speakers from our wildlife partner organizations, CLARM and GOWRS. So I'm going to introduce them both here now so that I don't disrupt the flow of the presentations. And so I'll start by introducing Daniela Barreras-Biesot from CLARM. So Daniela is a senior technical advisor at CLARM. She actually joined OSRL in the UK in 2012, and during her 7.5 years working for OSRL, she responded to numerous incidents and supported internal activities as a senior response specialist, providing emergency preparedness and response services, and also was a core wildlife team member involved in wildlife activities and with responsibility for the wildlife equipment. Working for CLARM since 2019, she's been providing technical advice, delivering training modules, designing and delivering exercises on wildlife preparedness and response for authorities, the oil industry, and wildlife response NGOs. Daniela is also part of the Secretariat for EUROA, a network of organizations created to provide international expert resources for dealing with affected animals in marine wildlife incidents in Europe. So Daniela, really happy to have you here today. So thanks so much for doing this. Daniela is going to be joined by Adam Gorgan from GOWRS. So Adam is the coordinator of GOWRS, which is a network of the world's leading professional hands-on or wildlife response organizations. Adam previously worked for the RSPCA in the UK for 20 years and served as the head of wildlife for the last 8 of those. In this capacity, he advised on policy with regards to wildlife management and casualty wildlife, and facilitated research into methods of rehabilitating wild animals and how these methods can be improved to aid survival of these casualties. He's been working on wildlife response for over 10 years and served as co-chair of the GOWRS project since its inception in 2015. And Adam has also served on the Council for the Mammal Society for Britain and Ireland, the Executive Committee of the British Wildlife Rehabilitation Council, and until recently was president of the International Wildlife Rehabilitation Council. So thank you both for being here. Adam, I'll hand over to you first, and Daniela will follow shortly after, and then we'll hopefully have some time at the end to answer any questions that people may have, and we have a Q&A section of this where you can put those questions in the chat. So with that, I will hand over to you, Adam, and feel free to take control.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. Thank you for the introduction, and good morning and good evening. Yes, hello to everybody who's joining us for this conversation today. So I'm going to give you a quick run through of some of the principal regulatory frameworks regarding wildlife that may affect an wildlife response. This is going to be a relatively quick run through. We have 20 minutes, and so not a lot of time to get into a lot of detail. But first of all, just to say that as Paul has already said, I'm from the Global Law Wildlife Response System. I'm the coordinator. And the Global Law Wildlife Response System is run by a network of 10 wildlife rehabilitation rescue organizations based around the world who come together to provide a single unified voice for all wildlife response. And our aim is to ensure rapid, efficient assistance to affected wildlife to improve the wildlife response preparedness in industry, in government and non-government stakeholders aligned with internationally agreed practice. So in my talk, I'm basically going to introduce you to some marine environment agreements, run through some legislative principles regarding wildlife, and then look at some in-country examples. So that hopefully this will inspire you to look at the relevant legislation in your own part of the world or in areas where you are planning to work, so you have a better understanding of what's involved. So as you are probably aware, there are a large number of international conventions around the world regarding all wildlife or spill response, and some of them include wording on wildlife. So for instance, the Barcelona Convention includes references to the POSOF training manuals, and these can be available through their website. However, most of these conventions are not legally binding, and it's up to the signatory states to actually enforce that, bring the legislation into their own country by putting it on their own statute books so that these conventions become law. So many of you will probably, as I say, be aware of these conventions, and I know that Daniela is going to mention a couple of them later on in her presentation. So I've decided to look more at the wildlife legislation, how that may impact how we respond. So in terms of legislative principles for wildlife, so first of all, there's the possession and transportation of wildlife. So humans have collected wild animals for millennia. They have used them for display. They have always been interested in the variation of wild animals. But of course, this has an impact on populations. And attitudes over many years have changed. Many people are much more concerned about the environment and nature and biodiversity. And so many countries have introduced legislation to protect that biodiversity. And this legislation has basically brought in regulations to basically protect free living wildlife by protecting the habitats they live in, protecting the species by trying to protect the populations, allowing them to breed, reducing the spread of non-native species, protecting public safety, and so on. So many countries will have a legislative framework based around this. And furthermore, handling wild animals is not always a good idea. There is definite elements of risk just in terms of bites and scratches. There are potential zoonotic diseases. The recent outbreak of highly pathogenic avian influenza is one. And of course, COVID-19 is potentially another. And there's also the issues regarding the welfare of the animals themselves and so on. So what legislation currently exists that has regulates this? Well, on an international level, you've probably all heard of CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. And basically, this doesn't ban the trade in animals, it regulates the trade in animals. So animals are listed on one of 3 appendices, and if they're on these 3 appendices, then there are regulations in place regarding their movement. So highly protected animals are on Annex A, and their movements are very restricted and highly regulated, whereas animals on Annex C are not so strictly regulated. It doesn't include all species. It includes only those species under which there is some conservation issue. However, like conventions we mentioned earlier, CITES has to be brought into domestic legislation by the signatories, by the countries that have signed up to CITES, and so this will vary between countries. So CITES regulates the movement of animals, and so any requirement to move animals across borders will require a certain amount of paperwork and quarantine processes, and this can create a lot of complications. So there is also no exemption for moving animals across borders for veterinary purposes. You still need to go through a certain amount of paperwork to get that agreement. So part of the whole wildlife planning process should be, ideally, do you have facilities in country which provide a response? Because if you have to move animals across borders, then it's going to get very complicated. Most countries will also have regulations regarding veterinary treatment. So it will describe how vets operate. The legislation will usually have something related to the creation of a body that oversees veterinary work. It will describe what the system of regulation is. It will describe what vets, and perhaps more importantly, what non-vets can do in terms of treatment of animals. And it will describe what other people involved in veterinary industry, like veterinary nurses, what they can do. And also it provides access to pharmaceuticals. It will describe what drugs vets can use and so on. I think the one important thing to remember here is that vets in one country, or vets who may have been trained in one country, may not necessarily be able to work in another country automatically. There may be a process to go through to get dispensation for those vets to work in other countries. And again, this is something that really should be understood in advance of any oil spill response in case the need arises. And some countries also require permits for wildlife rehabilitation, but not all. So for instance, in the UK, when I was working for the RSPCA, there were no permits required to bring animals into wildlife rehabilitation, although this has changed recently in Scotland. So you need to be aware that the legislation will vary between countries and indeed between states. So again, the US is a good example where the legislation varies across the different states in the US. So the same principle regarding vets, if you want to bring wildlife rehabilitators in to a country to provide a response, then you need to understand whether or not they need to work under permits, whether they need to work under your local wildlife rehabilitators permits. You need to understand basically how is that legislation going to work in terms of the response you want to do. And because there's a wide variation in the regulation of wildlife rehabilitation, there is also a wide variation in standards. So there are no internationally agreed standards on wildlife rehabilitation, but some standards do exist. So the image you see on the screen is of a document that was part of the initial GOWRS JIT project that was produced by IPCA in 2017, which is available on the IPCA website. So this provides some of the standards for old wildlife care, for care of old animals. Other standards do exist. So there are standards produced jointly by the National Wildlife Rehabilitators Association and the International Wildlife Rehabilitation Council, which are primarily aimed at the US, working within the US, but they are available to others if people want to order them. And other countries will produce their own standards. So rehabilitating organizations will exist in other parts of the world, and they may also produce their own standards for the countries in which you're working in. But there is no common agreement, perhaps, across countries as to what these standards would be. And just as a note, the IWRC also provides resources that can help in terms of training. So they provide a foundation level course, which is used by some of the states in the US as the primary training course if you're applying for a permit in some states of the US. So when thinking about planning your potential wildlife response, or should you need one, you need to understand the legislation, how it's going to work in your country. So are there permits that are required? Are there vets available? Are the veterinary drugs available? And so this shows the importance of working with local wildlife rehabilitation facilities in your area, because they should know what the legislation is pertaining to their work. They will hopefully have vets who work with wildlife, who understand what the implications are and can therefore help. And then it also emphasizes the need for assessment, because you may write your plan and you may include local wildlife rehabilitators in your plan, but you also need to understand that, say, rehabilitation facility, they get very busy in the summer with juvenile animals. And so if you have a spill in the summer, there may be a question of whether or not they can assist or how much assistance they can give to you. The spill may also impact species which they're not used to seeing because of the migratory nature of some species. So although having wildlife in the plan and having an understanding of wildlife legislation in the plan is essential, an assessment is also required to ensure that you are ground truthing what's happening, so that you fully understand the implications of the spill as it's happening. So then to move on to some country-based examples. So in New Zealand, maritime New Zealand is responsible for the prevention and cleanup of marine oil pollution. So there are 4 pieces of legislation that are relevant. And the old Wildlife Response Plan is an annex to the New Zealand National Plan. WildBase, which is based in Massey University, is contracted to provide the old wildlife response, having written the old Wildlife Response Plan. And permits are also required under the Wildlife Act 1953 to undertake wildlife rehabilitation. And here you just basically see an outline of the structure of part of the national plan as required by the Marine Maritime Transport Act. And wildlife response is included as part of that plan. And so therefore, part of the New Zealand legislation is to include wildlife response. In South Africa, it's slightly different. So the constitution does include the need to keep for maintaining the environment and preventing pollution. The Marine Pollution Control and Civil Liability Act covers the protection of the environment from pollution and combating pollution at sea. And the National Environment Management Act notes its responsibility of all to prevent and manage and damage to the environment. More specifically, the National Environment Management Biodiversity Act 2004, or NEMBA, provides a legislative framework for the conservation and management of the country's biodiversity, including the protection and conservation and management of threatened species. And legislation that specifically mentions all wildlife response includes things like the Marine Pollution Response Bill and policies on management of seabirds, shorebirds, and seals. So under NEMBA, NEMBA regulates permits that are required for capture, transport, housing, and the rehabilitation of seabirds and other wildlife. It also provides permits for particularly threatened species, and the African penguin would be one good example of that. However, NEMBA does not define standards for wildlife rehabilitation, only requires a minimal demonstration of competence for people to obtain those permits. In Brazil, legislation exists, so the federal law provides for the prevention, control, and monitoring of pollution caused by oil and other harmful and dangerous substances in waters under national jurisdiction and other matters. CONAMA regulations regulate the minimum content of an emergency plan for oil pollution incidents in waters under national jurisdiction. originating in organized ports, harbors, terminals, pipelines, and landings, platforms, and their support facilities. It requires to include procedures for wildlife protection and to rescue affected animals, and this includes reptiles, birds, and mammals. And then Decree 10950 from 2022 has the National Contingency Plan for Oil Spills. And this points out the need to have trained personnel and specialized centers to guarantee the rescue and rehabilitation of animals affected by oil and their derivatives, and also determines which federal agencies are responsible for the supervision and response actions. So again, National Contingency Plan provides the structure for oil wildlife response. And it puts in place the need to have permits which allow for people to rehabilitate wildlife in Brazil. And so the National Emergency Action Plan for Wildlife Affected by Oil is a partnership between IBAMA and the Brazilian Institute of Petroleum. And the PAE is comprised of 3 parts, with IBAMA's actions during an oil spill of national significance, a good practice guide for handling oiled wildlife, and the environmental mapping for emergency response at sea project. So those 3 parts come together to provide Brazil's oiled wildlife response. So oiled wildlife response is a federal requirement, and operators are required to include it in their permits. So this has been a change in industry good practice, which has seen changes at a country level, and shows a particularly proactive approach to integrate wildlife into the IMS, the adoption of the incident command structure, and so that wildlife teams will be present in the command post. And exercises are also required to ensure that wildlife responses are fully played out so that they can test the effectiveness of such responses. It should be noted also that federal permits are also required to rehabilitate wildlife and for wildlife rehabilitation centres. So again, this is separate from the oil spill response legislation, that wildlife rehabilitators need to have those permits. In the US, the Oil Pollution Act in 1990 was passed after the Exxon Valdez incident in 1989, and it created a fund which is generated by tax on barrels of oil. It requires a national contingency plan, which leads to the development of area contingency plans and includes wildlife plans. And it should be noted that there is a difference between ACPs and area contingency plans and industry plans, with the industry having to fill in the area contingency plan covering some of the basics, and the industry having to deal with some of the detail in terms of doing their site-specific plans, how those site-specific plans would fit into an area contingency plan. So federal regulations in the Migratory Bird Act prohibit the handling of migratory birds, and so permits are required for wildlife rehabilitation. And again, there is variation between states in terms of wildlife rehabilitation, in terms of how permits are regulated and who needs permits. So as example, in California, the Oil Spill Prevention and Response Act, OSPA, was passed in 1990, and it saw the establishment of the Oiled Wildlife Care Network, and it requires that a number of wildlife rehabilitation facilities are kept operating in California. A research program is funded. Changes were made in 2008 to allow the preemptive capture of wildlife as part of a program to prevent wildlife being oiled. And the remit was expanded in 2015 to include inland spills as well. And again, permits are also required in California to undertake wildlife rehabilitation. And the same applies in Washington. And again, national and regional area plans exist, as well as industry contingency plans. And the Washington administrative codes require that planning standards are included for wildlife response, so that a wildlife branch must be located in operations. There must be a wildlife service provider who has been agreed with the state in advance, and they need to have permits to operate. And then all wildlife facilities requirements are specified in that legislation. So there is more information regarding country profiles in the CLR website, and I'm sure Daniela will talk more about that in a moment. So in conclusion then, the legislation regarding oiled wildlife response is complicated, and that's generally due to the legislation regarding wildlife and how we look after and interact with wildlife is complicated. And it's going to be very specific to the country and the state you are working in. So you need to have a plan. We need to be prepared, understand what the legislation is and how it would affect your operations should there be a spill. And including tier 1, tier 2 responders in your planning would be a great benefit here, because they should understand what the legislation is in terms of what permits are required for wildlife rehabilitation and other work relating to their work. And basically, also, you need to understand that the legislation will change, of course, over time. So somebody needs to keep an eye on the plan to make sure it's up to date and understand what changes will be needed to keep the plan current. So that's my run through. I will hand over to Daniela and leave questions till the end, I think, Paul.
Thank you, Adam. I think I've taken control now.
Okay.
So let me move to the next slide. Yes. So I'll go a bit further to what Adam has been explaining. So this time I'm focusing a bit more on Europe and the different regulatory frameworks for oil wildlife existing in this part of the world. So we will go through the EU legal instruments, so the directives and regional agreements existing in Europe, some national oil wildlife preparedness examples in Europe from different countries, some tools that could support European wildlife preparedness and response. Also, we will go through a case study in the Netherlands with the Bougival incident that happened in 2018, and some conclusions at the end. So let's go with those legal instruments. There are 3 directives quite relevant when it comes to wildlife and conservation of the marine environment, and all of them have been transposed into EU member state national legislation. So the Birds Directive and the Habitats Directive, quite often mentioned as the Birds and Habitats Directive together. So they are protecting more than 500 wild birds, including seabirds, and also establishing SPAs or special protected areas. Also, around 1,000 plants and animal species are protected under the Habitat Directive, and more than 200 habitats in land and sea. The directives also establish the the Natura 2000 network, and both directives are quite linked to the EU biodiversity strategy for 2030. The other directive that we find is the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, and that one establishes also the protection of the marine environment and also tries to achieve what they called a good environmental status. So none of those directives talk specifically about marine pollution, oil spills, or preparedness, but we recognize that the authorities and also the industry, of course, need to be aware of what is protected in those directives, what are the wildlife sensitivities, what are the protected species, and how they can be impacted by a pollution incident. So just some legislation there to keep in mind. Then we also have the Safety Offshore directives. So Europe also has this directive, which has been trying to put in place to set up some rules to help the prevention of accidents, as well as how to respond promptly and efficiently to those accidents if they were to occur. So they require operators to develop plans and also the authorities to develop external plans on the different operations in offshore. And it's in those external plans where they should include, and I read it as it says in the legislation, arrangements for the mitigation of the negative impacts on wildlife, both onshore and offshore, including the situations where oiled animals reach the shore earlier than the actual spill. So that directive entered into force in 2013 and had to be transposed by 2015, with also a transitional period for industry to be applied by 2018. In practice, many countries and the industry have not implemented that directive, or at least we have not seen the implementation of the wildlife part. We haven't seen many plans on that regard. As Adam showed, the world and also Europe is divided in several regional sea agreements or conventions, and they are in place to facilitate arrangements between the different countries, contracting parties, to work together and protect their seas from any marine pollution or any incident. So in Europe, we would like to highlight the Bonn Agreement in the North Sea, also the HELCOM Agreement or the Helsinki Convention in the Baltic Sea, and the Barcelona Convention in the Mediterranean Sea. So these regional agreements are including European EU countries and also non-EU member states countries. So the UK, Norway, Russia, North Africa, some countries in the Middle East are also included in those regional agreements. And also to highlight that the European Commission is also a contracting party. DG ECHO in the European Commission is one of the contracting parties to those regional agreements. The agreements, they try to implement the objectives of the OPRC Convention. They also advocate for preparedness, international cooperation, and mutual assistance. And they share the countries, different countries from the regional agreements. They also try to share response standards. They try to organize exercises and do research and development actions. So Sea Alarm and EUROA, Sea Alarm has got an observer status on the HELCOM agreement and also an MOU within the Barcelona Convention, an MOU signed with REMPEC, which is in charge of the Barcelona Convention. And also EUROA has got an observer status in the Bonn Agreement. And as parties, we try to push to see how wildlife preparedness should be included in those regional agreements, their action plans, the manuals, etc., etc. And we try to trigger those discussions and get the movement on wildlife into those strategic plans and activities that they are developing. So HELCOM is one that has developed further the references to wildlife and marine pollution. There is a HELCOM response group that has been providing recommendations to include wildlife response plans, and they have a specific chapter on wildlife response with those recommendations on how to develop wildlife response plans and how to integrate wildlife expertise like EUROA into their national responses. They've got an expert group on wildlife response, which Sea Alarm is chairing, and they try to get those exchanges of information and reporting on how each of the countries are preparing. And more recently, or more recently, is getting a bit more noted. The regional agreements, HELCOM, are doing exercises, the known BALEX exercises, and they try to include that wildlife response component into those exercises. And the most recent example was last summer. Then we've got the Bonn Agreement. The Bonn Agreement does not explicitly mention wildlife in their pure text, but the agreement's counter-pollution manual has a dedicated chapter on wildlife response. And then we also have the Barcelona Convention. Maybe it's from the three of them is the least concrete about wildlife protection arrangement, but it does talk about pollution emergencies and protecting the environment, the ecosystem, species, habitats, etc. So REMPEC is the organization mandated to make sure that the protocol of the Barcelona Convention is implemented, and they have been quite important in the recent years in developing this region's capability to deal with wildlife aspects and marine pollution. There is a Mediterranean strategy for 2022-2031. And that Mediterranean strategy includes in the action plan different actions related to wildlife, and some of them are including delivering training on wildlife topics. And in there is mention to the POSOF and also the EUROA courses to be done or to be carried out when it comes to preparedness and training. So that's for the 3 regional agreements. In the diagram showing in the slide is just a small example of how HELCOM and the chapter on wildlife response tries to include wildlife expertise into the wildlife response organization. So when it comes to regional agreements, there are frameworks, although they are not legally binding. But we have to say that some of those frameworks or some of those regional agreements have encouraged several countries to develop those wildlife preparedness plans, and also for some of them that had some already documentation existing, to improve them and strengthening them according to international good practices and standards. European countries and also regional agreements do recognize EUROA as a network to support wildlife preparedness and response, and there is a mechanism in Europe through the European Commission and DG ECHO, the ERCC, for European countries to mobilize this wildlife module that the EUROA network offers. So let's go a bit deeper into different countries in Europe. So if we have a look at the map developed by CLM that collates different information from the country profiles that Adam was mentioning, and if we zoom into that Europe framework, we will see that the preparedness expectations on the different countries are very varied. So we can go from poor preparedness to limited basis, and there are also some countries that have got a better preparedness level. So looking again a bit deeper into those countries, we see that some countries, like the ones marked in green, which are Netherlands, Estonia, and Finland, they've got a national plan and they've got a formalized relationship with a EUROA NGO in country and relationship with the authorities. So they kind of have an agreement and work together. And they also, and that's the top thing to have, they also receive some sort of funding from them. So they are kind of funded more or less depending on the countries, but they are funded so that they can carry out some activities and preparedness activities. Then we've got some countries marked in pinkish color, the second category, where we've got France, Belgium, Poland. They have national plans. They've recognized an NGO from EUROA in their countries, but they have no funding. So there is not that relationship where funding is provided to the organizations. And there's a fourth country in that category. I have to highlight Germany. So it's also included in this group now, but it might be becoming green in the next months or year, as there has been some progress lately towards setting up some sort of preparedness program in the country. So the next category, the yellow ones, Lithuania and Latvia, they are also developing plans, but there are no EUROA members in their countries. The brown category, so we see there Spain and the UK. Spain is developing regional plans. As you might know, Spain has got different regions, and those regions are responsible for developing their own plans. So there cannot be a national plan, but it has to be a regional plan. So the region of Catalonia has started some processes to develop that plan. And also in the UK, they are also working towards developing a stop note that goes together with the National Contingency Plan, the oil National Contingency Plan. So that stop note is directed for wildlife, but still being developed, so not approved yet. And then we've got a couple of cases, purple countries. So we call them a bit special, like Denmark, where the main strategy recognized by the authorities is euthanasia of oil birds by hunting them. And then also Norway, where rehabilitation is in principle not supported by the authorities. So bit of everything around Europe. So what tools do European or non-European countries or oil companies have to support wildlife preparedness and response? So to start with, the CLARM country profiles, as Adam was mentioning them, the CLARM website contains 108 country profiles available. They have been done via desktop research, but also by contacting stakeholders, different people in country, so that we have that direct communication with them. And the idea of the country profiles is providing that overview of wildlife arrangements and capability in each of those countries. So the country profiles contain information like wildlife at risk, habitats, protected areas, the different international conventions that the different countries have been signing, they are signatories of. Then the general arrangements for oil spill response, arrangements specifically for oil wildlife response, then the different relevant authorities and key actors that might have been identified in those countries, national strategies for wildlife, if there are any, and the response capacity in country, whether there is something or not. And all this information is collated in a database that CLARM holds, and also the different contacts that we are reaching out each year to update those profiles. So other tools, self-assessment tools. There are self-assessment tools for authorities. They are widely used in Europe related to those regional agreements. So they are a tool to report on preparedness for each country. And some of those regional agreements are requesting the countries to complete them and report on them. We also have self-assessment tools for energy companies or oil companies, call them how you prefer. And those self-assessment tools can be directed both to at a corporate level, so they can assess themselves at a corporate level, or to affiliate level, so the different entities that they might have in different countries. Another tool that has been widely mentioned in the last webinars and presentations on wildlife is the Wildlife Preparedness Wheel. So this preparedness wheel was introduced after the Cyprus workshop, and is just explaining a little bit how to process the preparedness path and what different steps you need to follow to be better prepared. Obviously, training courses, the more you train, the more prepared you will be. So there are in the market, there are available courses for managers or for hands-on wildlife responders, and they are all available from different expertise in worldwide. And then also exercises. Obviously, if you exercise, the more you exercise, the better you are in your preparedness, and proving that the trainings that you might have received are worthwhile. So exercises, you have them in many different formats. You can go from drills to full-scale exercises to tabletops, etc. Now becoming a bit more popular, the games, serious games, and Euroa, CLARM have developed a Wildex tabletop exercise dealing with wildlife, a different way to learn how to organize wildlife response, and also 1X, which is also including different products apart from oil, so dealing a little bit more with HNF, etc. So all the key tools are the networks. So those networks of experts are there to support any preparedness journey from any country or any oil company, energy company. Both GOWRS offered by OSRL as part of their SLA service, but also the Euroa network in Europe are available to support, whether it is to countries or to support companies. And on the map, you can see where the different organizations from those two networks are located. So a bit tiny in Europe, but just to highlight, in Europe, there are several organizations that are part of both networks, so GOWRS and Euroa networks. And obviously, the good practice guides developed by those networks, as Adam was mentioning, the IPCA guides are publicly available with lots of information there to follow, and also the Euroa different protocols and handbooks. Some of them publicly available, and some of them available with training courses. So now I'm going to introduce you to the case study of the Netherlands and the Boogie incident, a case study where preparedness, legislation, and expertise met quite nicely. So the incident started in June 2018. So the MS Boogie collided in the port of Rotterdam, releasing 217 tons of oil. The oil started spreading with the tides through a large proportion of the harbor and also up to the North Sea, causing a large number of swans oiled in the harbor. So the Dutch authorities, in this case Rijkswaterstaat, were in charge of the response and decided to activate the wildlife response plan they had in place. So the first reactions, as you see in the images on the field, were self-mobilizing people and volunteers trying to help to collect those swans and bring them somewhere. So swans were being collected and transported by citizens to animal ambulances with quite a lot of risk. As you can see in the images, not the best health and safety protocols were followed. And it was detrimental for the species and also for the people as well. So the oil wildlife response plan in the Netherlands identifies several parties that have agreed to work together. So different rehab centers and responders under the umbrella of a network called Zone Response. And also the plan considers the construction of a temporary wildlife hospital, as you can see in the image. And for that, they have a subcontractor contracted to build that. So when the incident happened and the plan was immediately activated, that subcontractor and some Euroa experts met together. And the following day, they were already starting to build that tent that you can see on the image. And on day 4 of the incident, the reception, the intake, and the stabilization sections were developed well enough to start receiving animals from the field. And so any animals that were collected on the field were transported there. And on day 7, the washing could start as well, because it took a bit longer to set up the washing department. So a total of 522 swans were taken for rehabilitation, of which 509 were released. So that means a 97.5 release rate. So why do we always explain the Boogie as a successful incident? And it's not just because of the high release rate that they achieved, it's also because of the different levels of coordination and preparedness that played together in that incident. So at national level, just to highlight the Zone Response network, so the different wildlife centers that were involved in the response. Also the fact that the authority, Rijkswaterstaat, took the lead. They had a plan. They had a subcontractor that was building a facility immediately according to the plan. And also that they had a preparedness program. So a few years before that incident, they actually built the same tent in a different part of the Netherlands, and they tested some procedures. So again, an important factor there is preparedness and the willingness to be prepared, to be honest. Then at regional level, we could also claim some sort of success because the Euroa network was completely supporting that incident. So several responders from different countries in Europe were mobilized to the Netherlands to support. Euroa network working according to their Euroa standards, the Euroa protocols, which were the same as they were used in the Netherlands. And again, those that regional or the national, the European network, the Euroa, was also supported by, well, the whole response was supported by some international organizations that are now also part of GOWRS. So, sorry. Those organizations also supported the response, and they also applied the protocols, the international standards that are also linked to the European ones. So all together working towards one response. So some conclusions there. So the European legislation is not specific enough for oil wildlife preparedness and response, but regional agreements have tried to put some push onto that and introduce some aspects on wildlife response into their agreements. They are not legally binding, so we know regional agreements are not legally binding, but they have put some effort into introducing the concept of the aspect of wildlife response into them. In many countries, national planning is still in progress or not started, so that is a fact. So the countries that have been prepared preparing seriously are a few. But there are tools and expertise to support that preparedness process. So what we are missing kind of is a little bit of willingness to be prepared. The EUROA system is a recognized network in Europe, and it's recognized by by the EU authorities to support. And just to end up, some recommendations for industry. So in Europe, wildlife response in many cases might face delays and lack of coordination, and we need to be aware of that. So it's not easy. So we are talking about Europe. We know it's not other parts of the world, but still there might be a lot of delays, and do not expect authorities to be prepared. As you could see from the maps, some of the countries are doing progress, are making good progress, but not all of them are prepared. So you have to be aware that you might be taking the lead of a response as well. And make sure that you as organizations, as companies, know what authorities are expecting from you if some wildlife is impacted because of an activity that you are dealing with. And the last thing that we could say is think of developing preparedness for your own risk. So you better be prepared yourself so that you can cover yourself as well on any reputations or any other risk that you might face with an incident that you might have. So that's me. And I think I will give control to Paul.
Thank you very much, Daniela, and thank you very much to Adam. That was yeah, whistle-stop tour of the world in yeah, really good timing, leaving us about 10 minutes for a few questions from all of you. And I do see one in the Q&A already. So while I ask that, just to remind anybody that does have a question, if you would like to, please just add it to that Q&A section. I think you should see a button at the top to get into that. But just to start off, yeah, really good question here from John. Nice to see you there. So the question is, I see very limited reference to triaging, prioritizing endangered species. So is there any formal or informal guidance, for example, to focus on endangered species and deprioritize those that are not endangered? Would that be a non-regretted strategy to follow? And is that actually outlined in country-specific contingency plans? So very interesting question there. Adam, I wonder if you might want to take that first.
I can try. Thank you, Paul, and thank you for the question. I'm not aware of anything particularly. I know some countries will rather prioritize certain species over others, and I know this has created some interesting conversations about how do you plan an oil spill response. I think one of the situations that we've had when we've talked about this, when I used to work for the RSPCA, is that by definition, endangered species are often rarer, so they often don't come into care as often, and therefore you have less understanding of how they do in rehabilitation, unlike common species. So Daniela's example of the Bojambala is an interesting one because swans, many European rehabilitators deal with swans all the time. They have a very good understanding of how to put them through a rehabilitation process. But if you had a large number of much rarer seabird, then our understanding of how to look after that bird becomes more difficult. So, yes, I mean, I can certainly understand how people would think that way. I think it's just a difficult one to manage. I do know that SANCOB, of course, have a major program in terms of the African penguin, just because of the conservation status of the African penguin is such that it needs as much help as it can get, and rehabilitation by SANCOB, as well as the other work they do, is a major part of the conservation efforts to try and protect that animal. So I don't know, Daniela, if you have anything to add.
I think it all comes to wildlife planning and having a wildlife plan. In the wildlife plan, you will be assessing what's your worst case scenario and what are the type of species and protected or not protected that you might get, and looking at the numbers that you might get. So you have to do that assessment. No, what's the worst case? How many birds are you going to get? Is it 20 or is it 500 or is it 1,000? And how many of those will be protected species? So in that wildlife plan, you need to start to write some guidance about what your strategy is going to be. Are you going to protect them all? Are you going to rehabilitate them all? Do you need to sacrifice some species in order to be protecting the others, especially the ones that have some protective status? So I think at the end, it's legislation marks which species are protected, but I think it's the wildlife plan which should be stating as well, or identifying those protected species and how you are going to deal with those protected species, and if they have a priority in your triage process. And obviously that's something that the responders, the experts working in a facility, will be taking care of. So these are one of the criteria that they will be using. Obviously that's responding, but if you have it in a plan, much better, because then you might get some time saved into that decision taking. So if you have that planning process and your stakeholder involvement with the authorities as well on what you're going to do if something happens, and if you do it that in advance, that might save time to save many other animals. But of course, planning is the key, I think.
Yeah, great. Thank you both. And it's worth mentioning there's some great references and information on the use of triage and obviously the role of euthanasia in those good practice guides for anybody that wants to have a further look. But a great question, so thank you for that. I did see somebody's hand go up in the chat. I think we have the ability for people to unmute here. So Øystein, I saw you had your hand up. Did you have a question there?
No, I question. It was just information that in Norway, even though euthanasia is the main policy, there are 2 species that are mentioned in the that are to be rehabilitated no matter what.
Yeah.
But there's very few of them, and because we don't have a policy of rehabilitating birds, there's very little in-country expertise on the matter. So yeah. So
yes, something we are aware of.
I am not very happy with my country's policy in these matters. Yeah.
Thank you, Øystein. No, that's very helpful. It's a good example there. And I think we're almost at time, and I don't see any other questions here, so I might just add one in here just to close, which
there is a question from Barbara in there, Paul. Sorry.
Oh, I apologize. You're right. I'm just refreshing here. So yes, so thank you, Barbara. So do you think that the California model for providing funding should be followed by other countries to guarantee the wildlife response resources, especially rehabilitation facilities? Yeah, that is a really great question, and it seems to be more rare that there's funding in these programs than not. So yeah, let's see. Adam, do you want to answer that one then?
I would say yes. It needs to be hand in hand with the legislation that goes with that in terms of improving standards for wildlife rehabilitation, for all wildlife rehabilitation. But I know, and Daniela can speak to this in terms of the EUROA network isn't funded in the same way. The EUROA network is funded through grants, which have to be applied for, as opposed to the OWCN, which is a continuous source of funding. So I would definitely say yes, it should be, but with regulations to support it.
Yeah, California or the Netherlands. I mean, the Netherlands are doing great lately as well in the last years. It took a while to get that plan, the wildlife plan, running and accepted and embedded, but now the implementation process is quite relevant, and they are getting funds to train hands-on responders from the different centers at different EUROA levels, so they from advanced to specialists. So they are building up, and managers, they are building up their expertise as well. So that way of implementing a plan, and also about not just providing training, but also exercising. So creating the opportunities to exercise, I think it's just great. So I know, yeah, California is about the facilities and money to develop some activities. But yeah, I mean, I think there are 2 clear examples there that could be followed.
Yeah, thank you both. It makes me think of the preparedness wheel, and there are obviously those 2 sections of it, the purple section developing a plan and the green section which is developing and maintaining capability, and without that funding it makes that green section incredibly challenging. So certainly something that hopefully we will see more of in different countries going forward as this becomes a much more sort of integrated and accepted aspect of good practice. With that, though, we have to come to a close, especially if there's anybody that's jumping from this session to the Spanish language webinar that's just about to begin. So all that's really left for me to say is thank you very much to our presenters today, to Daniela and to Adam. for some really excellent information shared. Thank you all also for attending. And as I said at the beginning, don't forget, if you're interested, there are other webinars happening this week that you're welcome to sign up for. But on that, I will wish you all a good day, and we'll look forward to seeing you at an event soon.
Thank
Bye
you
for
all
now.
for listening.
Thank you all. Thank you very much, Paul, for organizing.
Thank you. It was helpful. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Yes.